You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with James Rampton, columnist at The Independent, and Kate Andrews, economics editor at The Spectator. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now, starting with the Bristol Post, which leads with the news that a woman has been arrested on suspicion of murder after the bodies of 3 children were found in a house in the city. The Metro says that supporters of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny believe his death in prison was planned to the second by Vladimir Putin. The Guardian also leads on that story, with Navalny allies alleging that Kremlin officials are now trying to cover their tracks. The Mirror says Subpostmasters are urging people to oust the Conservatives from power amid refuted claims that they tried to stall Horizon scandal payouts to help them win the next election. On that same story, The Telegraph says the business secretary has dismissed those claims as lies. The Financial Times reports that Apple is facing a possible fine of €500 million for allegedly breaking EU rules over access to its music streaming services. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by James Rampton, columnist at The Independent, and Kate Andrews, economics editor of The Spectator. Welcome to both of you. Let's start with the front page of the Metro. And the death of Alexei Navalny is still front page of many of the papers. This take his supporters saying, well, accusing Putin of having planned every second of his murder. They're describing it as murder, James.
Well, certainly all the Western leaders are laying it at President Putin's door. President Biden has said as much. And we were saying earlier, it's really quite shocking. I found this has really shaken me, this story, because if there was a tiny glimmer of hope in Russia, it's now been snuffed out with the death of Navalny. Of course, there's a fantastic history of Russian tyrants disposing of opponents. Stalin famously killed 80 of his doctors because he didn't like their diagnosis and struggled to find a doctor after that. But this is a shocking story. The details that are alleged by campaigners who are supporting Navalny, but they have a ring of truth in my ears. They're saying that the FSB arrived 2 days before at the Polar Wolf camp in the Arctic Circle, switched off all the CCTV and listening devices. And the really chilling bit is that just 2 minutes after Navalny's death, there was an official announcement that he died, you know, which really indicates that it was all pre-planned, that somebody within Putin's regime said, we've got to get rid of this troublesome priest, you know, this troublemaker is making too many difficulties for us. With the election coming up next month, which, by the way, there's no chance of Putin not winning, we've got to eliminate all opposition and, by the same token, assert my power and terrify anyone who might dare to stand against me. Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, called Putin a monster today, and I would absolutely agree with that.
OK, the detail there for just 4 minutes after Alexei Navalny's death, state-controlled social media also claimed the cause of death was a blood clot.
And now that's being changed. They're saying that he died of sudden death syndrome. What's being told to Navalny's family and his lawyer seems to be changing by the moment. They can't locate the body. They don't know if that's going to be possible for weeks, if not months. Understandably, those closest to Navalny and indeed the entire Western world is demanding to know what happened and why he is dead. And there are these accusations from Navalny supporters that the Kremlin is covering its tracks. And as James just pointed out, there's so many questions about the timelines here. There are reports from prisoners in some papers saying they were told about Navalny's death in the morning. It was reported in the afternoon, yet the press release was ready to go. James made that point about the CCTV being dismantled 2 days before this death. Obviously, you know, the use of the word murder is completely understandable, given the fact that We know how the Kremlin likes to treat its political opponents. It is devastating that Navalny has been killed. It's very important that we know exactly what happened. Of course, it fits into the entire narrative of a dictator that would invade a sovereign country like Ukraine. So, you know, we can't say we're surprised in some ways, but we can say that it's utterly devastating.
Meanwhile, Navalny supporters and, dare we say, protesters are continuing to come out on the streets in Russia, wanting to pay their respects to Alexei Navalny, and they're being arrested in some numbers. Recent figures, close to 400 people arrested.
Yeah, I mean, I really commend the bravery of these people, and that echoes Navalny's own courage. I watched the documentary about him over the weekend that won the Oscar last year, and there's a very, very moving bit at the end where the director asked him, you know, if you are sadly killed, what would your message be? And he said, if they kill me, it means that we're incredibly strong. And then he used the famous quote from Hannah Arendt about the Nazis, you know, all that is necessary for evil to triumph is that good people do nothing. And he said, don't do nothing. His courage, particularly after what happened to people like Litvinenko and the Skripals, was astonishing. He deliberately went back to Russia after he'd been poisoned with Novichok, knowing the risk that he was taking. He's an absolute hero. And the people who are protesting his death are extremely brave as well. 400 plus have been arrested. They were protesting at the very well-named Wall of Grief, which is built in memory of Stalin's victims. So there's a real echo there to the past. The tyranny of the past is now being thrown forward into the present in the figure of this appalling tyrant.
And it should be noted that these are some of the biggest protests we've seen in several years now in Russia. As you say, very brave people, but overnight you've had Kremlin operatives come in and sweep away the flowers, sweep away any signs of protests. They are trying to wipe...
They have been replacing them. They've been courageous enough to actually replace them.
Incredibly courageous. People come, they keep taking it away. There is a deliberate attempt here by the Kremlin. They've essentially taken Navalny's name out of most state media, and the story is barely being reported on. They're desperately trying to erase him completely and erase the idea that anybody would support him. And it turns out that the Russian people on this occasion, again, you know, very brave souls coming out and saying otherwise.
Do you think we will continue to see protests and people coming out?
Well, it's very difficult to say in instances where there have been protests and there have been huge crackdowns, understandably, that, you know, that has caused a lot of fear. These people are not living in a free democratic country. So you can't have the same expectations, of course, as you would see in the streets of London or elsewhere.
Let's turn to the Metro and an invitation from President Zelensky to Donald Trump to visit the real front line.
Yeah, this is interesting because just last week, Trump incited a lot of criticism for encouraging Putin to attack NATO countries that don't pay their dues. In fact, a White House spokesman said the idea was unhinged. I think it'd be great if President Trump actually experienced the reality of military action. He famously called people who died in the Second World War losers in a moment that shocked his chief of staff, who then resigned after that. He also said that John McCain, who was captured during the Vietnam War, was not a war hero because he said, I don't like people who were captured. This is a man who dodged the draft for 5 years because he had flat feet. What sort of courage has he ever shown? So I think it's a very good idea of President Zelensky to invite him. That $600 billion package is being blocked by Trump supporters in Congress. Perhaps if Trump were to go, although he's far too cowardly, in my view, to go, he might change his mind and say to his supporters, actually, Zelensky is a brave man, deserves our support. He's the last bulwark against the tyrant that is Putin.
He's not going to go, is he, Kate? What do you think?
In those sneakers, he might go.
You know,
Golden sneakers.
Yes.
I don't know whether or not he would go. I mean, this is somebody who did sit down with the dictator of North Korea. I mean, to be very clear, two very different kinds of circumstances, but actually when Trump fights with people publicly and on social media, that doesn't necessarily mean he doesn't try to make amends later or try to, you know, soften things later. I actually find it difficult to imagine that Donald Trump, especially if re-elected, wouldn't be engaging with Zelensky. He almost certainly would be. What the story, I think, is the reason I think it's very important is because in the UK, we take for granted sometimes that whether the Conservative Party or the Labour Party wins an election at the end of the year, the position on Ukraine is broadly speaking going to be exactly the same. It is not contested. That is not true in the United States. The opposition to the funding going to Ukraine, the £95 billion that the Senate has approved, that the House has now said, we're taking recess, we're not voting on this right now. The Republican Party is increasingly opposed to the idea of this foreign aid. Donald Trump is leading that charge. And if the United States were to take a different stance on Ukraine, that would impact the world. It would impact the war and it would impact the world. And so this invitation, you know, it's punchy. Zelensky says that the front line is an Instagram. The front line is war. You know, I think he's trying to get the president's attention. I suspect he desperately wants Donald Trump's attention because he knows that Donald Trump's opinion on this could frankly make or break at some point what's going to be happening in Ukraine. You know, these two men and their relationship could end up shaping how the war in Ukraine goes.
And James, do you think that the death of Navalny will change the American stance on the war in Ukraine?
Well, I would hope so. I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene, in my view, deeply unpleasant MAGA supporter, last week used a very rude phrase to criticise the British Foreign Secretary for suggesting that Congress should back Ukraine. Biden today said he thought it was unethical that Congress was blocking this aid package. The death of Navalny has had a huge ripple throughout the world, everywhere except Russia, as you say, and even the most hardline, narrow-minded xenophobes in the Trump camp might be slightly moved by this. That would be my hope, anyway.
James and Kate, for the moment, thank you. We can take a break. Coming up, the Mirror says Subpostmasters are urging people to oust the Conservatives from power amid refuted claims that they tried to stall Horizon scandal payouts to help them win the next election. Stay with us for more on that. Welcome back. You are watching the press preview. Still with me, James Rampton, columnist at The Independent, and Kate Andrews, economics editor at The Spectator. Let's have a look in this section, starting off with the Guardian story on the front page. And this is Keir Starmer saying that the fighting in Gaza must stop now. This is perhaps the most straightforward, decisive he has been on the situation in Gaza. James?
Yes, he's been as clear, as you rightly point out, as he has been yet, saying the fighting must stop. He still won't use the I word, immediate, which was used by the Scottish Labour Party and is a word that many Labour supporters are demanding that he use. I think he's really caught in a difficult position here. His main policy, in lieu of huge policy gaps, is not to be Jeremy Corbyn. And I think he's made a very, very successful attempt to purge the party of accusations of anti-Semitism. So he's extremely concerned that he is shown to support the right of Israel to defend itself, but not to tip over into some of the things that have been happening in Gaza. So he has to tread a very, very fine line. And he gets into difficulties, as we've shown last week in Rochdale. He had to dismiss the candidate there for, you know, appalling comments that he made about false conspiracy theories about Israel. So he has to walk this tightrope the whole time. And I don't envy him, because he wants to keep people who support Israel on side, but a lot of his supporters also support the Palestinians. So it's a really difficult path. And I think so far he's managed it. But you may not agree, Kate.
OK, this comes ahead of the Commons vote on Wednesday of a motion calling for an immediate ceasefire.
Well, he has managed it so far, but this is an area where his party does not agree, and this is an area where in the House of Commons he has had some of his trickiest moments. So when a motion was last put forward, 56 Labour MPs voted against it, and you had 10 shadow ministers leave their post. He is desperately hoping to avoid another round of that. He doesn't want to lose more shadow ministers. He doesn't want to be seen to have a party that's completely divided, especially in an area like foreign policy, especially one as sensitive effective as this. So he is working with the SNP, which is bringing forward the motion to talk about the language. And as you said, they are debating that word immediate. And, you know, the fact that it would come down to one word, you know, I think raises questions about, you know, what is your actual overall vision here? What are you really calling for? But, you know, unfortunately, sometimes the trickiest, most nuanced, most difficult things that we have to deal with get caught up in politics.
Let's turn to the Post Office, also quite political, and this is the Submasters urging voters to oust the Tories. This is after claims that the Tories tried to stop payments, compensation payments to Horizon victims in order that it might not affect any pending general election. Yeah,
I ought to preface this by saying that Kemi Badenoch, the business secretary, actually refutes these allegations by Henry Staunton, the former Post Office chief who was sacked by her last month. Anyway, his allegation was that the government had asked him to stall on payments so that they weren't open to more financial liabilities before the election. And Michael Rudkin, whose wife was wrongly convicted in this scandal and was one of the people who was portrayed in the wonderful ITV drama, said, this government needs to be punished at the ballot box. We're 24 years on. How long is this going to take? And I suppose that, for me, is the takeaway. You know, people are arguing about she said, he said, who said what when, but there are over 700 sub-postmasters who were wrongly convicted, the biggest miscarriage of justice in British legal history. Their cases need to be sorted rather than executives fighting with ministers. People will see that almost as offensive, that they're battling to save their reputations while these people, 4 of whom sadly committed suicide, many of whom went bankrupt, divorces, children being bullied at school. Those are the people we should be focusing on, not high-flying executives and ministers. Kate, the public sympathy is going to be with those sub-postmasters, and they quite possibly will listen to them say, you know, oust the Tories.
Well, look, I think that stories like this illustrate just how desperate people are to finger point, to say that, look, it wasn't my fault, the fault was over there, and then others are going to say, no, the issue is with the ministers, the issue is with the tech, the issue was with, you know, other parts of the public sector. The truth is that people were failed by pretty much every branch, and responsibility has to be taken across the board.
We've just got time to have a look at the BAFTAs very quickly. James, we've got about 10 seconds.
Well, I'm delighted that Emma Stone won Best Actress. We were discussing it earlier. I was going to see that film with my mum. I'm delighted that I didn't, because it's quite sexual. But what I would say is that it's great that such an oddball, weird take on the Frankenstein myth should be acknowledged. There are so many, you know, Marvel comic book heroes that we're being forced down our throat, but something weird has been celebrated. I'm glad.